The most expensive silence in the history of my courtroom began at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Usually this room is filled with the shuffling of papers and nervous defendants, but today the air felt heavy. It smelled of money. Entering through the back doors wasn't just another citizen, it was an event. Surrounded by 4 lawyers in suits that cost more than most people's cars, walked Damian Musk. At 22 years old, the hypothetical heir to the world's biggest fortune didn't walk like he was facing justice. He walked like he was inspecting a property he intended to demolish. He wore a simple black t-shirt, but on his wrist sat a transparent Richard Mille watch worth $2 million, a quiet reminder that his time was infinitely more valuable than ours. He didn't sit on the defendant's bench, he lounged. He pulled out a prototype phone and started scrolling, completely ignoring my bailiff. To Damian, the law was just a suggestion. Sitting across from him, looking small and terrified, was Sarah Jenkins, a 64-year-old retired librarian who drove a dented Honda Civic. She held a handkerchief to her face, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't have a legal team. She didn't even have family with her. She was alone, facing a young man who had destroyed her life 3 weeks ago, and was now looking at her like she was a bug on a windshield. I looked over my glasses, reading the charges. Reckless driving, destruction of private property, leaving the scene of an accident, and attempting to bribe a police officer. I've seen everything in my 40 years on the bench, but I have a special radar for arrogance, and it was screaming red alert. "Mr. Musk," I said, keeping my voice steady, "put the phone away. You are in a court of law, not a board meeting." He didn't look up immediately. He finished typing a message, hit send, and then slowly slid the phone into his pocket. He looked at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Sorry, Judge, just closing a deal that pays for this entire building. You were saying?" The audacity sucked the air out of the room. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. But before I tell you how I handled a man who thinks he can buy the verdict, I have a small favor to ask. I have a dream of hitting 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. I'm just a small creator trying to share stories where justice actually wins. If you believe that no amount of money should put someone above the law, please click that subscribe button right now. It takes a second, but it changes my life. Thank you. Now back to the courtroom. I ignored his comment about buying the building. I turned my attention to the victim. "Ms. Jenkins," I asked gently, "tell me what happened." Sarah stood up, her legs weak. She told the court that she was stopped at a red light when she felt an explosion. Her car spun 3 times. When the paramedics pulled her out, she saw Damian standing by his silver futuristic truck, which barely had a scratch. He wasn't checking on her. He was yelling on the phone about a dent in his bumper. But what broke my heart was what she said next. "Your Honor," she said through tears. He walked up to the stretcher and threw a stack of cash on my chest. He told me to buy a real car and stop making him look bad. Then he just left. He left me bleeding on the street. I turned slowly to Damian. "Is that true? Did you leave the scene after throwing money at an injured woman?" Damian sighed, standing up and buttoning his jacket as if he was late for lunch. "Judge, let's cut to the chase. Physics happens. Her car was fragile. I offered her $10,000 cash. That's more than that scrap metal was worth. I didn't flee. I had a meeting. My security team handled the police. Then, he did something I had never seen in 4 decades of service. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Actually," he said, opening it, "can I just write a check to the city for $50,000? Would that speed this up? I'm sure you have potholes to fix. Let's call it a donation, and I'll be on my way." The courtroom froze. Offering money to the city in open court wasn't just arrogant, it was dangerously close to bribery. But Damian Musk didn't care about optics. He genuinely believed that I, like everyone else he had met, had a price tag. I took off my glasses and placed them gently on the bench. "Mr. Musk," I said, my voice low and cold, "put your checkbook away before I add contempt of court to your list of problems. You seem to be under a delusion. You think you are here to negotiate a business deal. You are not. This is a courtroom, and in this room, the currency is not dollars. It is respect, and right now, you are bankrupt." He laughed softly. "Respect, Judge. My father's satellites are broadcasting this hearing. I could buy this courthouse and turn it into a server room by lunch. I'm trying to be generous here." That was the moment the prosecutor, Ms. Gonzalez, stood up. "Your Honor," she interrupted, The state has body cam footage from the arrest that the defense tried to suppress. It shows exactly who Mr. Musk really is. I ordered it to be played. The screens flickered to life, showing Damian holding a glass of whiskey, staring down two police officers at his mansion. On the video, he stepped close to the officer and said, "You touch me, and you'll be working security at a mall by tomorrow. Do you know who I am? I am the future. You are just the help." As the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. I looked back at Damian. The look in my eyes was no longer just stern. It was the look of a man who was about to teach a very painful lesson. I watched that video on the screen, seeing this young man, who has probably never heard the word no in his entire life, threaten a police officer with unemployment just for doing his job. The courtroom was dead silent. Usually, when a defendant sees themselves acting like a monster on camera, they look down, they feel shame, but not Damian. I looked over at the defense table, and do you know what I saw? He was stifling a yawn. He was actually bored by his own cruelty. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a traffic case. This was a test to see if the American justice system still had a pulse, or if it had finally been bought out completely by the highest bidder. His lawyer, a man named Mr. Sterling, who I knew charged $1,500 an hour, stood up before the screen, even faded to black. He adjusted his silk tie and gave me that smooth, practiced smile that usually signals a lie is coming. He moved to strike the video from the record, claiming his client was in a state of shock after a traumatic accident. He called Damian's comments to the officer a stress response, not a genuine threat. He even argued that Damian was under the impression this was a private security matter, not a police interaction, and that we couldn't penalize a young man for being confused in a high-stress situation. I had to grip my gavel tight just to stop my hands from shaking. I asked him if telling an officer he would be working as a mall security guard sounded like confusion. To me, it sounded like a promise from someone who knows exactly how much power his last name carries. Sterling didn't flinch. He simply pulled a document from his briefcase. He presented a signed affidavit from the police chief stating that the officer in question had mishandled the situation and that the department wasn't pressing charges for the threats. He suggested the court focus only on the traffic violation. There it was, the invisible hand of influence. I don't know who made the call or how much was donated to the Police Benevolent Association that morning, but somehow the department had been convinced to back down. This is how it always happens. The rich don't break the law, they just bend the people who enforce it until the charges disappear. But in my courtroom, I am the only one who decides what disappears. I denied the motion immediately. I saw Damian's head snap up for the first time. He looked genuinely surprised. I told them I didn't care what the police chief said in a memo. I cared about what I had just seen with my own eyes. The video stayed. I turned my attention back to the victim, Ms. Jenkins. She looked smaller than ever, shrinking into her chair as Damian glared at her. I needed to understand the full extent of the damage. I needed the record to show exactly what unlimited wealth does when it crashes into a normal life. I softened my tone and asked her about something I saw in her eyes, something that wasn't caused by a car crash. I asked if Mr. Musk or anyone from his team had contacted her since the accident. Sarah hesitated. She looked at Damian, then at his lawyer, and I saw pure terror. She gripped her rosary so hard her knuckles turned white. I assured her she was safe here. She took a shaky breath and told the court that 2 days ago she received a phone call from a restricted number. The voice was digital, like a computer. It said that if she came to court today, her pension fund might have some accounting errors. It warned that accidents happen to houses just like they happen to cars. The gallery erupted. People were gasping, whispering. This was mafia tactics disguised as corporate strategy. Sarah began to cry, explaining that as a retired librarian, her pension is all she has. She admitted she almost didn't come, but her neighbor convinced her that if she let him get away with this, he would just hurt someone else. I felt a cold anger settle in my chest. Witness intimidation is the ugliest crime because it attacks the very foundation of truth. If people are too scared to speak, there is no justice. I looked at Damian. He wasn't looking at Sarah. He was typing on his phone again, hidden under the table. I shouted his name, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the room. I ordered him to stand up. He stood slowly, looking annoyed, asking, "What now?" I asked him directly if he authorized anyone to threaten this woman's financial security. Damian let out a short, dismissive laugh. He looked me in the eye and said, "Judge, I have 50 million followers on social media. I have companies to run. Do you think I have time to look up the phone number of a librarian?" I have people who handle cleanup. I don't know the details. If she got a scary phone call, maybe she should block the number. It's a free country. I repeated the word cleanup back to him. I asked if he called terrifying an elderly woman cleanup, if he treated human beings like oil spills that need to be wiped away. He shot back immediately, his mask of boredom slipping just enough to reveal the arrogance underneath. He told me he treats problems like problems, and that right now this hearing was a problem. He looked at his watch and said, "Look, how much for the pension threat? Throw it on the bill. I have a launch to attend in 3 hours. Throw it on the bill." Those 5 words hung in the air like toxic smoke. I have heard defendants say many stupid things in my career. I've heard them curse, I've heard them lie, I've heard them beg, but I had never heard someone try to open a tab for witness intimidation. Damian leaned back in his chair, checking his watch again, treating the destruction of Sarah's peace of mind like an appetizer he had ordered and now wanted to pay for just to leave the restaurant. I looked at his lawyer, Mr. Sterling. Even he looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, sensing that the room was turning against them, and decided to do what high-priced lawyers do best: attack the victim. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "let's look at the facts. We have a young, high-profile individual driving a very conspicuous vehicle, and we have Ms. Jenkins, who, let's be honest, is struggling financially. The defense posits that Ms. Jenkins saw who was in the rearview mirror. We believe she slammed on her brakes intentionally. We believe this wasn't an accident. It was a brake check designed to force a collision and secure a payout from a wealthy family. This isn't a hit and run, Judge. It's a shakedown." Sarah gasped. She tried to stand up, shaking her head violently. "No, that's a lie. I stopped for a red light," she screamed, her voice breaking. "How dare you?" "Sit down, Ms. Jenkins," Sterling barked at her, asserting dominance. "We have seen no evidence of a red light. It's your word against his. And frankly, your financial records show you missed 2 mortgage payments this year. You were desperate." I felt a knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. This is the oldest trick in the book. If you can't defend the crime, destroy the accuser. They were painting this terrified grandmother as a mastermind criminal just to save the reputation of a boy who treats police officers like mall security. Damian was smiling now. He liked this narrative. It made him the victim. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Finally, someone is making sense. Tell him about the insurance scam." I was about to intervene to stop this character assassination when the prosecutor, Ms. Gonzalez, stood up. She was holding a small metallic drive in her hand. She looked calm, too calm. "Your Honor," she said, cutting through Sterling's speech, "Mr. Sterling makes an interesting argument about his word against hers. He claims there is no evidence of what happened in those split seconds before the crash. But he forgot one thing." She turned to Damian. "Mr. Musk, your father's company prides itself on building the smartest cars in the world, doesn't it? Cars that see everything? Cars that record everything?" Damian's smile faltered. For the first time, he stopped scrolling on his phone. "The state subpoenaed the telemetry data from the defendant's vehicle," Ms. Gonzalez continued, plugging the drive into the court system. "We didn't just get the camera footage, we got the black box logs. The machine doesn't have a mortgage to pay. The machine doesn't care who your father is. The machine just records data." A graph appeared on the main screen. It was a timeline of the crash. "This red line is the brake pedal," the prosecutor explained, pointing to the screen. "And this green line is the accelerator. Mr. Sterling claims Ms. Jenkins brake-checked the defendant. But the data from your client's own car shows that Ms. Jenkins was stopped for a full 4 seconds before impact." She zoomed in on the green line. It spiked vertically. "And here is the defendant's car. 0.5 seconds before impact, the vehicle was traveling at 45 miles per hour. But right here, instead of braking, the accelerator was depressed to 98%. The car accelerated to 62 miles per hour at the moment of impact." The courtroom gasped. I stared at the graph. It wasn't just negligence. He hadn't just looked away. He had sped up. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the room. "Mr. Musk, why did you accelerate into a stopped car?" Damian stood up, his face flushing red. The cool, bored billionaire air was gone. Now he looked like a cornered child. "The car, the software, it was a glitch. It's beta software. My dad says the autopilot sometimes. Manual override was engaged, the prosecutor cut him off. The logs show you were driving. You were frustrated that traffic was slow. We checked your text messages sent at that exact second. You texted your friend, "Move or get moved. Watch this." And then you hit her. The silence that followed was absolute. He hadn't hit her by accident. He had hit her because she was in his way. He used a 3-ton steel truck as a battering ram because he didn't want to wait for a red light. You used your vehicle as a weapon, I said, the realization settling in. You saw a citizen following the law, and you decided your time was so important that you could just push her out of existence. Damian looked around the room. He saw the anger in the gallery. He saw the disgust in my eyes. He saw his lawyer facepalm, realizing the case was lost. Panic set in, real panic. He pulled his phone out again, his hands shaking this time. He wasn't texting, he was dialing. "Mr. Musk, put that phone away," I ordered. "No," he shouted back, his voice cracking. "I'm calling my dad. He needs to explain this. This is his car. It's his fault. You can't do this to me. Do you know who he talks to? He talks to presidents. He talks to kings. I'm putting him on speaker." He held the phone up like a shield, as if the voice on the other end could stop the walls of justice from closing in. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. Beep. "The subscriber you have dialed is not available." Damian lowered the phone slowly. His father wasn't answering. For the first time in his life, his money, his name, and his connections were silent. He was alone. "Mr. Musk," I said, and this time I didn't sound angry. I sounded final. "Your father isn't here, neither is his checkbook. It's just you, me, and the woman you tried to crush. And I think it's time you learned that there are some things in this life that you cannot buy your way out of." Damian slowly lowered his phone. The screen went black. For the first time since he walked into my courtroom, his shoulders slumped. The silence that followed the unanswered call was deafening. It was the sound of reality crashing down on a young man who had spent 22 years living in a fantasy world where consequences were things that happened to other people. He looked up at me, but the arrogance was gone. It was replaced by something pathetic. He's probably in a meeting," Damian stammered, his voice trembling. "He'll call back. You can't proceed until he calls back. He has lawyers who can explain the text message. It was a joke. It was just a joke." "A joke?" I repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "Ms. Jenkins is sitting there with a broken collarbone. She can't lift her arm to brush her hair. She wakes up screaming from nightmares of metal crushing around her. And you call that a punchline?" I stood up. I rarely stand up before the final sentence, but today I needed to look down at him, not from a bench of authority, but from the moral high ground that he had surrendered the moment he pressed that accelerator. "Mr. Musk, you entered this room wearing a watch that costs more than most people will earn in 3 lifetimes. You offered to buy this courthouse. You tried to buy the police. You tried to buy me. You thought your net worth was your net worth as a human being." I paused, looking him dead in the eye. "But let me tell you something that your father's billions evidently couldn't teach you. In this courtroom right now, you are the poorest man I have ever seen. Ms. Jenkins, with her dented Honda and her empty bank account, has more dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire empire. She has character. You have nothing but an empty checkbook and a disconnect from humanity so severe it borders on sociopathy." Damian opened his mouth to argue, but I slammed the gavel down. Bang! The sound made him jump. "You said you are the future. If people like you are the future, people who view their neighbors as obstacles to be rammed out of the way, then God help us all. You want to go to Mars? You want to save humanity? Mr. Musk, you don't even know how to live on Earth." The prosecutor nodded. The defense attorney was staring at the floor, knowing there was no motion in the world that could save them now. "Please, stand for sentencing," I ordered. Damian stood up. He was shaking, real, uncontrollable shaking. "On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of leaving the scene of an accident, guilty. On the charge of witness intimidation, which you so arrogantly tried to pay for like a bar tab, guilty." "Your Honor, please," Damian whispered, tears finally streaming down his face. "I'll pay her $1 million, $2 million. Just don't put me in there. I can't survive in there." "You should have thought about that before you sent that text message," I replied cold. "Money cannot fix this. You need time to think, time to realize that you are not the main character of this universe. I am sentencing you to 3 years in the state correctional facility, I announced. The gallery gasped. 3 years was a heavy sentence, but for the malice shown, it was necessary. 3 years? Damian screamed. My father will destroy you. You can't do this. I am not finished, I interrupted, my voice booming. In addition to the prison time, you are ordered to pay Miss Jenkins $500,000 in restitution immediately. And upon your release, you will not be driving futuristic trucks. Your license is revoked for 10 years, and as part of your parole, I allowed a small, grim smile to cross my face. This was the justice Ms. Jenkins deserved. You will complete 1,000 hours of community service. Specifically, you will be assigned to the custodial staff of the Providence Public Library, where you will clean floors and repair books, serving the very community Ms. Jenkins dedicated her life to. You will learn the value of labor, Mr. Musk, starting now. Bailiff, take him into custody. No bail. The officers moved in. Damian Musk, the heir to the galaxy, didn't walk out like a king. He was dragged out, kicking and screaming like a toddler, begging for his phone, begging for his dad, begging for someone to take his money. But his money was no good here. As the heavy doors closed behind him, muffling his screams, I looked at Sarah Jenkins. She wasn't cheering. She was simply weeping. Tears of relief. The nightmare was over. The monster wasn't under her bed. He was in a cell. Thank you, Judge, she whispered. Don't thank me, Sarah, I said, gathering my papers. Justice is not a favor. It's a right. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. The internet exploded. Elon tweeted that the trial was a sham and a Matrix attack, but he never visited his son. He was too busy launching rockets. Damian served 20 months of his sentence before being released for good behavior, though guards reported he spent most of his time crying in his cell. When he finally got out, he didn't go back to the mansions. He went to the library. People in Providence say if you go there on a Tuesday, you might see a young man who looks vaguely like a billionaire, quietly reshelving books, checking his cheap Casio watch, finally understanding the value of other people's time. And that is why we do this. That is why we stand up to power. Because in America, the law is the great equalizer. If this story made you believe that justice is still possible, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Help us reach our goal so we can keep exposing the truth. Share this video with someone who needs to see a bully get what he deserves. I'm Judge Caprio. Court is adjourned.